My friends, welcome to Cage Talk. Dark Side of the Cage is a series that looks behind the curtain of mixed martial arts. Cage Talk, I talked to some brilliant martial artists who were there. Enjoy.
Pride Fighting Championships was a great time and nobody died. Well, I guess that's not true, but
Yakuza bodyguards put a gun to my head. They said, sign it.
It wasn't a surprise about Yakuza existing in mixed martial arts.
when somebody's paying you that kind of money, you don't ask certain questions.
Fans and fighters started to realize Pride will not survive.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.
Josh Barnett, man, thank you for hanging with me.
Sure, my pleasure.
So, also thank you for sitting down and chatting with us for Dark Side of the Cage. I don't think you've seen the episode yet, but it's really brilliant, and your story's just added a ton. So thank you.
I don't even think it's aired yet, has it?
No, and not at the time you and I are talking. It has not. Have you seen the Kimbo episode or any of the ones that have aired up until this point?
No, not at the moment. I'm really not a person who watches television, but I should get around to it.
No, you shouldn't. Television, man. Like, what would be something you would do with your time while other people are consuming stuff like that? What do you do?
Probably on a computer, working on projects or researching things. Could be reading a book, or I do like to watch comedy, like Kill Tony, or
Yeah.
maybe there's so many movies that I'm always looking at from years gone by that I may have missed or didn't know about. That's kind of my thing.
But it's maybe fair to say you'll do more creating than consuming?
Depends. Like consuming content, I try not to. But I mean, not that I'm against like visual arts or anything like that, because I'm not. But I spend a lot of time just trying to figure out how to finish the projects I got, start new ones, how to be more successful in the things that we're doing, because I want them to survive.
When you are working on something as an artist, a creator, what is the initial thing that will often drive you? Curiosity, the desire to make something? Like your projects, where do they come from?
Passion. They're just an extension of stuff that I already enjoy. And then I look into, is there a way to make a business or monetize it, or create a version of it that I think would be better or interesting, or maybe that hadn't even been done before.
Isn't it just the coolest thing in the world that, like, presumably you're sitting in a pretty nice home, that at least by the standards that you want it, and you spend your life building stuff you dig as a way to exist, as a way to pay your bills. And isn't that cool? Like, isn't that all anyone should dream of?
Well, it's not for everyone, I mean, it comes with I don't want to say baggage. It's not really that kind of thing. It has its own way of moving and operating, where how you get paid, how you monetize things, and a lot of stuff you just have to do with no expectation of it really taking off. You just have to build it. But everything that I remember growing up and finding like so cool, from the most underground or independent stuff to mainstream things, either American or some from foreign media. Somebody sat down and decided that they wanted to put something in the world that they thought was cool or interesting or worth it, or a story worth telling, or a thing worth building so others could do it. So I just don't see, I see myself as a kind of person as being so inspired by it and capable of it. So I do it. And those that aren't capable of it, that's fine. I'm sure in some way, maybe I'll be working with them because they'll be building assets or doing work for hire for me, or maybe they'll be participating in it, or maybe they'll be enjoying it themselves. So it's not a closed circle.
A bit of a tangent question, but have you read Rick Rubin's book by chance?
No.
So you know Rick Rubin, the music producer.
No,
He's
I
kind
know,
of
I know who Rick is.
yeah. He's written a book sort of about the artistic process. And for him, the audience comes last. That's a big part of his thesis about it is you make it out of your desire or need to make something, and who may consume it in the future, that's incidental. What do you think of that thought?
Well, uh, that's really been my way of approaching it too. You don't build something for an audience that already exists because the chances that that audience could have shifted or that mood or tempo or aesthetic has shifted by the time you get it built. That's like being an ambulance chaser, kind of. I'm not trying to chase the audience. I'm trying to create an audience. Um, and a lot of times people, fan bases, what have you, will tell you tons and tons of stuff and they'll say but the thing is, if a lot of the times they don't even really know what the thing that they really want is. They don't know how to fully express it and describe it. And it's up to you to go out there and make it. And either you'll succeed or you won't. Sometimes you don't even succeed on your own timeline. That's where we get like the label of cult classics. But I don't think, I think if you're looking to build something based on what the fan bases or things are saying, by and large, you're losing, and you're now going to deal with people that they're not the builders, they're the consumers, and their thought process, while I think really useful to understand to a degree and to see some through lines, if you get caught up in that, you're gonna be trying to chase other people's visions, and how could that be sincere?
I've I've enjoyed your work as a martial artist and a storyteller and lots of different things and throughout your career. But forgive me, did you work with Matt Hume for some length of time in the world of martial arts?
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was my first professional fight coach. I was with
Yeah.
Matt Hume for, I think, well, from 1997 until about 2005, six maybe, or yeah, till 2006.
I ask because I had this conversation with him that was similar in martial arts, and I was asking him about observing what other people, the trends in fighting. Something is happening, you observe it, and then find answers to it. I said, "Do you do that?" And he kind of looked at me. This is 15 years ago, and he looked at me like, "Wow, I thought you'd understand this better." Not in an insulting way, but that was the feeling I got. And he was like, "You can't do that." He's like, "You have to be trying to create the perfect martial artist or the perfect expression of fighting, not answering other people's problems." And this is somewhat connecting to what you're saying about being a creator. It's like we can't anticipate where things are going. We can't respond to where they are today. We just have to honestly make and honestly express yourself as an artist. Is that accurate?
It is, but there are like aspects of context that lie within that. So for one, the perfect fighter isn't this like the perfect fighter isn't this unified general concept. Like it just wouldn't work that way because every individual is different in terms of their physical gifts, the way they think, the way they feel things. And so your perfect fighter has to be first constructed off of what could be the perfect fighter for this guy or this gal. And then within that, it's like, well, where are they fighting? Well, if it's unified rules, then how do you game the unified system? Look at all the ways that the unified system is being gamed, find ways that it hasn't been, and exploit that. But if you say build a fighter to be perfect at fighting in the UFC, that doesn't mean that they would be a perfect fighter for Ryzen. So you have to think about where are you going to engage with this. But I do think that there is some element of you can create a fighter capable of being able to adapt what they do to whatever environment that they're in. And that would be part and parcel with the idea of creating the perfect fighter. So, yeah, that's the way I would see it. But also, just adopting what everybody else does, again, yeah, you're chasing. Chasing is losing. If you're reacting instead of dictating, generally you're losing in a fight too.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. When you were fighting in Japan, Pancrase, Pride, um, what was different about? I mean, you were a different human at the time, but what was unique to fighting there during the Pride era?
It's still a lot like that even to this day, and that is the Japanese fans really want to see people with heart and determination and guts, and they want to see the best fight possible out of their opponents, or out of these two combatants, and they want to see something that's heroic and shows a, beyond the ordinary or average in terms of heart and skill and technique and fight. You do that, you have fans for life. In America, they ride your train until you take a loss or something, and then they bury you. And then maybe after a little while, you're allowed to come back, so to speak. You know, you can make your comeback run, but if you should fail in that comeback run, then they double bury you. It's just, it's and it's a different landscape to navigate, where it used to be in Japan, although this is slightly changing, that if you took the Conor McGregor type of self PR, or self promotion, that you would be probably kicked out of places or not allowed, or at the very least, you'd be looked on upon poorly. That's kind of changing as certain aspects of culture are being affected by, I think, probably Western culture in this case. But in the UFC, that gets you top billing. You know, of course, that kind of approach means you got to win at all costs. If you don't win, you just riled everybody up, and then all these people that wanted to see you lose, they got what they wanted. Now getting them to spend another buck again can be difficult, which is difficult with taking a very hyperbolic approach towards how you promote yourself and your opponents. But even Connor understood that at the end of the day, you can talk all the trash you want, but when you do win, boy, you better cover this guy in so much sugar and honey, and build him up, because if you don't, then that really puts you into a corner. And now the stakes are so high, and if you should lose, you could lose literally everything.
You brought together two really interesting observations about, as you're mentioning, this is how the West consumes it, but it also could be a part of the time. But one of them being sort of talk, bragging, storytelling, provocation. And the other one being that today people seem to really be more interested in the outcome. You won or you lost, and that means everything. Whereas during a different time, the story might be as meaningful, or the desire to dare greatly and fail would still be highly respected and appreciated. Whereas today, yeah, we will have a beef, you and I will have a beef on Twitter, and then we will fight, and if you win, people will look at me as if I'm terrible or I could never have won, and then we'll move on to the next two. And there's something that feels, yes, it's Western, but it also feels like of the moment. Do you agree?
Yeah, it is. We lack proper meaning making apparatus these days. We lack proper direction in things that are not immediate gratification, but are in fact towards long-term goals, and not just goals for yourself or long-term success and things for just you, but for those that you'll never know. We don't think civilizationally anymore. We don't have tradition all that much. We act as if these are chains that must be broken and removed because they restrict us. But the thing is, us with a total unrestriction generally uh, turns out into bad outcomes with people that have very little capability of controlling their impulses. And things don't last hundreds of thousands of years just arbitrarily. Generally there's a reason for it. And to think that people in the past were just stupid morons because they didn't go to Stanford or something. I mean, that's just, that is one of the most arrogant and just miscalculated um, considerations ever. I mean, that's just a preposterous, stupid way of thinking. But that is, modern thinking in and of itself is so much of this idea that every day further in history we go, that somehow that's better than the day before. I mean, there's no that doesn't actually track at all if you read history. Not to mention, you think like, well, we're here at this point now, and for all good, bad, and everything in between that comes with it. But if you have any feeling of that we've come somewhere that has things to be lauded, or we've created things that never existed, or have moved certain things about culture and or technology further in some way. Well, how the hell do you think we got here? Just by a bunch of idiots rubbing sticks together all day long? I mean, come on now. Like the idea that the Middle Ages was just filled full of just total um, uh, like superstitious, supernatural driven morons that didn't know anything about science, and they didn't even know the world was round. And it's just so utterly preposterous. It's just absolute idiotic propaganda that I'm not entirely sure where it stems from, but it really does come from a way of thinking that has very little capability of abstract thought. And one easy way to dispel such a thing is go look at all the cathedrals built during the Middle Ages. Go look at the castles. Go look at armor. Go look at ceremonial, or what you would consider not necessarily just luxury, but like some of these handcrafted items of antiquity are just absolutely beyond. I mean, that's not even to get into like there are from the Victorian era on, like even below, there are um, wind up and mechanical toys and dolls and sculptures that are insane. Like the amount of ingenuity and precision that went into making these things. It's like gigantic clocks. And not to mention, go look at things like gigantic clocks. Go look at like the astronomical clock in Prague. And I know that it has been rebuilt after World War II, but it was built before that. It's just it's all in front of you if you have any ounce of even slightly deeper thinking, or ability to compare and contrast things and understand even the smallest level on how things work. And the fact that even if you stand in front of these things, you can't figure out how the hell anybody came up with this, that's already an indication that that's pretty impressive. So in any case, I'm now on a tangent, but yeah, it is. We live in a world without honor, and if you have no honor, you have no shame. And if you have no shame, you just go online and you sling your hook out there with the cheapest, greasiest bait you can, and you're not even looking to catch any like real, particularly good fish. You don't care if you pull up a boot or a tire or whatever. You're just all you care about is that someone saw you and paid attention to you, because you're lacking something within yourself, some sort of depth of your own self-confidence and um, your own concept of forging destiny without the approval of the masses.
So much fascinating thoughts that you're throwing out here, Josh. Thank you. Among them, if we're thinking about not understanding the past, if you could somehow in your mind, a person could look at the past and assume it's rudimentary and makes no sense, whether we take heavy metal or architecture or boxing, and you look and you see a boxer, doing this, and you say, well, he's a primitive. How we can't imagine that 100 years in the future, we would look at today the same if we automatically assume that about the past. Why wouldn't we, 100 years in the future, look at fighting or music or whatever today and say, well, it'll be rudimentary 100 years in the future? That and not just our misunderstanding of the past, but our deep misunderstanding of the present. It's just, it really is a wild, when you explore art, fighting, any kind of art, and you think about it in these contexts, you can really go into some fascinating things.
Well, it's because people, by and large, are unable to escape the paradigm in which they exist in. These paradigms of culture, or any current zeitgeist, to use Hegel's term. Um, it's just they live in it so deeply, and they're so entrenched in it that they cannot see outside of it without anything being brought in by it, and therefore colored by it and presented in the way that the paradigm of your current paradigm would do so. Um, to be able to remove yourself from these sort of things, live within your current paradigm and understand it, but also be able to give yourself a 10,000-foot view to have a broader picture, and to even be able to drop yourself down as microscopically as possible to look at things in a more detailed fashion. I mean, it's just I would say it's flexibility of the mind. It's a thing that not everybody's going to be able to do. But then again, by and large, I would think you wouldn't have people that were incapable of doing it being any priest or priestesses of those disseminating such things to the world, as in working in departments of media, or advertising, or I don't know, you know what I mean? You would just be like, wow, this person just doesn't have that skill set, so let's move them over there where they will be successful, and let's have those that are capable of it, work in that space. Of course, that's always hard to do, but we just everybody thinks they're all capable of everything at all times, and guess what? You're not. It's just
Yeah.
that's just unfortunately we're not capable of creating and doing everything we can in the world. We should try to do our best efforts and expand ourselves and see if we can't find untapped potential or skills that we didn't know about. But um, I think after enough trial and error and time, you start to figure out who you are and what you're really capable of doing. I mean, you could be a person that has incredible skill um, at a certain activity or endeavor, and yet the way in which it needs to be done by you to make it at the level that is of its highest capability that you can produce, maybe it's just too time consuming, mentally consuming, spiritually consuming. It just, the fact that you can do it doesn't mean that
Doesn't
it's
mean you have
capable
to
of
do
you
it.
doing it all the time. And that's kind of a tragic concept, but it is true. And it's not all that uncommon, not to mention just understanding that there are going to be people out there that are just more able to do things in a bigger, broader. Sometimes it'll be just a singular endeavor, like they're just a master at that at a way that you maybe never will be. Or there are those folks you come across. It's like, I don't know how this person's able to do all of this. This seems way beyond the capability of any one human being. But then, every now and again, you get someone like that.
Yeah. Yeah, if we kind of root this back to when I mentioned that it just looks like you're living exactly the best expression of your life that you could. You're a guy who likes fighting and pro wrestling and music, art, creating, and here you're examining that and expressing those things in a world where it's a bit of a race to the bottom, like you're alluding, where the easiest way to get some of your work noticed is literally just take a dump in the middle of a room with cameras on you. In a world like that, where everybody's kind of looking for the easiest response, regardless of what it means, doing the opposite is scarce, and scarcity has inherent value. So in a world of everything being samey and further and further out, just being able to be an individual is actually a good thing now. Being able to be one of one actually is a good way to make a living and to be yourself and have a good life.
Well, I always tell the people that I work with, make yourself highly individuate yourself from everyone else, because you want to be the sort of thing that can only be purchased from one source, and that's you. If they could buy it
That's good
somewhere else
advice.
cheaper, then they will.
That's good
And
advice.
even when it comes to, even the idea of taking a crap on the floor with cameras on it to get noticed, the person today that would do that 99.9%, I'm sure of, doesn't understand why John Waters had Divine do it and Pink Flamingos. They don't get that there's a reason why a lot of these auteurs did certain things. Not everything lands, but they went out there and they did it anyways. But sometimes that was to shock, and that was a moment to completely unsettle the audience and to shock the world. Doing it now in that fashion it doesn't have the same effect as what John Waters set up. And by the way, he set it up. That's why a person like John Waters, while a total outcast type, misfit, what have you, but brilliant. He's a brilliant author, and he can do mainstream if you want. Go watch Crybaby. It's just the guy, he knows what he's doing, just as such as David Lynch. David Lynch understood Americana very, very, very deeply, deeply enough to subvert it and to do very, very, very unusual things with it. But pay attention to the themes, and you'll see that David Lynch isn't just a guy out there doing wild, goofy, wacky stuff necessarily. I mean, and like I said, not everything lands, and not everything lands for everybody. Meaning that, like, perhaps some maybe scenes from a David Lynch project won't land with others, but might land with you. And that's it. You can't be everything to everyone, and nor should you ever try to be, because that just makes you the lowest common denominator.
There's this sort of illusion that the world gives you the message that it will be safer in the middle of the pack. But that's kind of an illusion, and certainly all the action is on the edges. But even this, thank you for the gift of this conversation, because it's really, really fascinating stuff. But there will be people that would see this and comment and say things like, Josh Barnett says a lot of things, but they don't mean anything. What they mean is, I don't understand what he's saying, therefore it must not actually mean anything. And through that will be said because you're not trying to appeal to that person. It's not your business whether or not they know who John Waters is. It isn't your business whether or not they know who Lynch is. You're literally just expressing your ideas, and there will be human beings that will find this conversation fascinating. But to your point, not everyone. And neither is that the point.
Right. It doesn't matter. Like, a lot of people are so sure of themselves. What is it? The Dunning-Kruger effect concept, that they become more sure the more ignorant they become, or the more ignorant around something they are. But nonetheless, it would be good that if people were able to be more self-reflective and introspective and to understand things. But also sometimes it's just, maybe they just don't jive with my energy, right? So the message is digestible for them, but just not from me. And this is where I look at coaching, and I'll think like, well, I have all my ways of teaching somebody how to shoot a double leg, but somebody else has will teach everything in exactly the same mechanics, but they teach it in a different format, or they teach it in a different cycle or
tone,
progression. And the way that the words they use may be better for somebody than mine. And this is another reason why I like to send my fighters on sabbaticals whenever I get a chance to send them off somewhere. And I like to do it, especially when I can separate them from their training partners and their friends, and send them out there on them by themselves, all alone. So the thing that they're going to be focused on most is their experience in that moment, so they can get the most out of what is happening there. And also not just for the training, but everything else that comes with it. Because sometimes I'm sending them to Japan, I'm sending them to Thailand, I'm sending them these different places, and I want them to really live in that experience and allow those moments and that sabbatical to really affect and change who this person is for the better, because that's the whole point. But yeah, you get a lot of people, like I talk about how weight cutting is the thing that should be removed from MMA most of all. You really care about CTE and brain damage and long-term fighter health. Yeah, make everybody fight far truer to their actual weight, and you'll reduce a massive amount of that. But of course, I get a decent amount of pushback that it's just like, well, they're really poor arguments. They don't deny that it's damaging or that any of the negative effects that I've said are or are not true. What they do is they just go, yeah, well, so what? Well, I don't want to. Basically, I don't want to change anything. Who are you to say anything? Oh, that's just cope or whatever. It's like, well, okay, fine. I'm glad that you don't care about the health of the athletes within this sport. Not to mention, it's like, well, why create a weight class at 135 if you're all going to show up at 158 pounds?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that doesn't make any sense to me. But they don't. It's like this is a thing that has been gamed for so long, because that's what it is. It was gaming. Somebody figured out, like, well, if I only have to make weight on the day or the day before, whatever it is, then I'll make the weight. But then, I will figure out, I'll rehydrate back up. And in fact, I'll come into the ring with an advantage of being larger than my opponent, especially if that opponent doesn't think in the same way as I do. It's just a way that the system was gamed under the rule set or whatever this common concept of a rule of weight classes. And it just got done for so long and abused for so long that now people are just take it as a given. And the idea of affecting that in some way is tantamount to, pulling gospels out of the Bible now. And it's like, oh God, okay. Well, I mean, they did that too, by the way. Like the
Yeah.
King James is not the actual full, you know, his biblical historical record. So just keep that in mind. So
Yeah,
nothing
people
is
do.
sacred. Everything can
This
be
is
changed
what
to a
people
degree.
do. It's true. Josh, I want to talk to you a little bit about Pride, which is now kind of a small chapter of a very big life as an artist and a martial artist for you. But when somebody, a young fighter brings it up and asks you about it, what are some of the root things you tell them about Pride in that era?
I think a better way of describing this is, what is it that they usually say? And this is the commonality. Pride was the best. Pride was the best. Nothing was better than Pride. Everybody that hasn't watched Pride is really missing out. That is the through line. That's what I hear more and more and more. And Pride was a big part of my life, and it still does play a big factor, especially every time I'm in Japan. And uh, Ryzen is doing a very good job of trying to rekindle that, but Pride being the originator and being in and of its time, I think that's another thing that people have a hard time wrapping their head around, is that, Pride comes off how it does in its time because of what's around it, and the moments and the way things in MMA in the world were at that time. Whereas now, Ryzen does pretty much everything just like Pride used to, but it doesn't have the same impact that Pride did. But that doesn't make Ryzen worse necessarily in any way. And in fact, it might not be anything that Ryzen is doing wrong, although we have to at least come into this thinking that they're not perfect. But it could also just be temperaments and just sort of whatever the way the wind is blowing at the time, and in different cultures. And there you go. I know Pride, as big as it was in Japan, it didn't really need to be in the U.S. While there was U.S. Penetration into the market, it wasn't the same, and they didn't need it because, man, they were putting on the biggest shows in the world, still the biggest shows in MMA that have ever happened. And what do they need to come over here to do anything for? They didn't, but they could have, and if they'd done it a lot earlier, it would have been a lot better for them. But it is the way things turned out, how they turned out, and the people who made these decisions, you can't always make the right ones. We could sit back and really try to dissect that, but ultimately the thing is, the right decisions weren't made, and they were just one of many that ended up costing them in the end. But Pride and now Ryzen is an incredible experience, and night and day from being at a UFC card. That's not just to say better or worse. It's just to say they're just very different products with a very different feel. And I would say, KSW over in Poland
Yeah.
would fall into the same. These guys were at Pride and were so taken by what they saw that they went back to Poland and have fought to and forged to recreate it. in what is easily Europe's biggest MMA organization. But, it doesn't get talked about that much over here either.
And I don't know that that matters to them. When I've done bits and pieces of work with KSW, and although they wouldn't mind having North America see it and consume it and understand it, they certainly don't need it. But when you say they were present and they saw what Pride was, what was it? Like what it was big and it was bold but what are the details that made it special?
It had a larger than life presentation that elevated the fighters into a heroic ideal. They put a lot of effort into like video packages to introduce you to who this person is and finding these beats to give you a reason to care about them as a fighter, but also to try to educate you about how they fight at the same time. And presenting this stage that came off like F1 races, just a big international, we are like the pinnacle of the world's entertainment, whereas the UFC came off as America's, even though it was also an international organization, fighters from all over the place. But Pride did a much better job of portraying that grand scale of the world comes to this ring versus what the UFC was doing at the time.
If you were teaching a short course on history, how would you explain why Pride ended?
Pride ended because of the cultural phenomenon of the nail that sticks up gets hammered in Japan, and their associations with the Japanese underworld in the mild to the wild then became public knowledge and broadcasted essentially to the masses, and that is just unallowable. So with that being done, that was the end of business. Now, I imagine that they must have also played maybe a bit too fast and loose in ways that if they had better operational security, let's call it, they might still be around, but it would be really hard to maintain that an organization like that in Japan if these underworld, these Yakuza connections are too known, too prominent, and too in your face at that point. Because it's not as if there weren't people that didn't know who certain folks might have been sitting in the front row, but that's a far cry different from if money was ever exchanged or, well, the fact that, a lot of venues are owned by Yakuza in some ways. So, I mean, if you had to rent the venue, you still would have to rent it from them. And that doesn't even necessarily mean like it's like well, how would you call it? Like, it's not like, hey, you're paying me money to keep your thing safe. So it's not like a racket necessarily. It can be. I mean, it runs all gamuts, but it's also sometimes like, no, they just literally own it. And so if you're renting it, you got to rent it from them. I'm not saying that's always the case, but I mean, these are just certain instances. And so once those manager producer types got ran afoul of these underworld figures and kind of, I mean, if you watch the episode, I say, look, man, nobody that got harshed by the underworld didn't know that what they were doing would get them harshed by the underworld. They did it anyways. And that's why I don't have sympathy for them, because they created their own problems by doing things that they absolutely knew were going to go against the way business is done in Japan, and business, especially with these types, which they were already, it wasn't like they stepped into it and like, oh no, I got blindsided. That would be a different story. That's not what happened. And then everybody that then ran with it as a report, again, they knew what they were going to do. They knew that Pride would be destroyed. And, maybe they might be the type of person that feels like they're an anti-underworld crusader. And hey, fair play to you, but do I think that, how about this? I'm not inclined to think that journalists are going to go out there and do things because of like a deeply held sincere belief. I'm generally of the opinion that they're going to go out there and do it because they think it's going to make them money, and they don't care who it hurts.
That thank you for that. That's you know, the second episode in the Pride is the fall of Pride, and so those are really important details. But that idea, whether it's in politics, in society, in any culture or environment, the idea that we know what is and isn't accepted, and we just push it a little, we don't get penalized for it. We push it a little and we get away with it. And we push it a little and the audience or the environment accepts it. We start to think that place we pushed it is the acceptable place. And then when it all falls down, we act surprised. But we see that in politics, we see that in government, we see that in art, you see that in everything. That desire to just push the limit, get away with it slightly until you've pushed too far. Some kind of weird aspect of some human nature, I think.
Well, it's our ability to reflect on the moment, neutrally, and to see like, hey man, you got away with this, instead of being like, yeah, of course I got away with it, and I'll get away with it again. You thought I'd get anyway? Hey, that was something. Wait till I get away with this next thing. Okay, life's not necessarily just a ratchet where every position you advance to somehow negates or isn't affected by where you came. So it doesn't work that way. But it's easy once you're finding success or getting away with something that you tend to you forget that you can very easily get blinded by your position and not remembering where you came from, and not just like, oh, I don't ever want to go back there, but let's say how did you end up there in the first place? Was there any reason why that was the case? Any reason that was due to you or external factors? And with that, why is being where you're at now so much better? If it's just because your wealth has increased or your notoriety has increased, like for what end? Those things alone are not going to tell the whole tale of how you got there. Not to mention they're not inherently going to protect you from something if what you're doing is the wrong way.
Yeah, man. Thank you for these ideas. I'm thinking about a lot of this. What before I let you go with gratitude, what are some of the projects and creative pursuits and things you're working on right now that you're most excited about?
We have John Campbell, who was like the big man over at Lafroig for many, many years. And he's now our head distiller at our distillery, making Warbringer bourbon. So I'm really excited about the future and what we could do with that, and what sort of new projects and things, and just streamlining and production, and having somebody with that kind of knowledge and capability is only going to make what we do that much better. And we've been winning medals left and right ever since the beginning. So I can only imagine how much better that's going to become. The American Catch Wrestling Association is something that my partner Fergus McTaggart started some years ago, but now we're really getting it going. We've had our second national championship. We are working behind the scenes with some folks to try and make it the kind of thing that could be hosted all over the United States, where you would have appropriate officiating, judging criteria. Everything could be put together in a way where people are running these events, and now these other combat athletes get a chance to compete in our modern catch wrestling rule set. And that's really big to me, is to bring catch back as a competitive sport, not just as an art. And to do so, you need to have competitors, and you need to have the ability to create new competitors. That comes with coaching and competition. So working hard on making that, a thing that can grow throughout the entire U.S. Josh Barnett's Bloodsport, coming up on our 13th show here, April 17th, Thursday, during WrestleMania week. And it's always a big deal. There's always a ton of buzz around it because we get athletes from WWE, AEW, TNA, New Japan Pro Wrestling, MLW, Ring of Honor. Everybody is welcome because this is a neutral ring, and it's an event that I've created from the way I was brought into professional wrestling, and from all of the experience and the coaching that I've had, and from the ideals of those that trained me, but also it's a place that's wrestler forward and wrestler first, which is why we are able to get a lot of the talent we get, because surprisingly, to myself even, they reach out for it, knowing that it could be in WWE and being in these huge arenas and yet go, yeah, I want to be there in front of 1,500 people for way less money than I make because this speaks to me.
Yeah.
So, Josh Barnett's Bloodsport is doing quite well, and we're looking to continue with the Bloodsport Bushido show in Japan. And I don't know if we'll be able to get a show up this year, but next year I would expect so. And that was a lifetime goal, was to be able to put together a show in Japan based on how I have my vision for professional wrestling. And then it's just being the best coach and manager I can be to my athletes. So trying to find Victor Henry another fight here in the UFC, at 135, a guy he just defeated, took out undefeated Peyton Talbot, Raoni Barcelos, super great fighter, very tough kid. And we've got another guy in there that has been on quite the streak. What is his name? He's got an unusual name. Damn it, from Arizona. Fuck. Well, I can't remember his name. Anyways, this dude, Victor, beat him as well, and he's up there pecking at the rankings. So, Victor wants to go out there and get back on the wagon of winning. So, there's a lot of different things, and of course, there's also my own personal just projects like getting my 75 Firebird finished, or other little stuff like that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I just want to build things that are Kyler Phillips. That's the kid's name.
Yes. He's talented.
I want to, I want to keep, like I said, build things that are not just for me, but for others, and that will be here long when I'm done with them. So that's where these things like the American Catch Wrestling Association comes in. That's where Josh Barnett's Bloodsport. That's where even developing these athletes as a coach and as a manager, and who knows, they might become coaches or managers themselves someday. Mm-hmm. And at the very least, they have they at least have one way of approaching how to pass these things on.
So cool, man. It's really great to talk to you again. And thank you again for doing Dark Side of the Cage for us. And thank you for chatting. As my adult lifetime, I've been a fan of your work as a martial artist and a creator. And it's really awesome to talk to you. Thank you so much, Josh.
Oh, my pleasure.
Thank you so much for hanging with me today on Cage Talk. Until next time, enjoy the hostilities, my friends.
Pride Fighting Championships was a great time, and nobody died. Well, I guess that's not true, but...
Yakuza bodyguards put a gun to my head. They said, sign it.
It wasn't a surprise about Yakuza existing in mixed martial arts.
When somebody's paying you that kind of money, you don't ask certain questions.
Fans and fighters started to realize Pride will not survive.
Dark Side of the Cage, Wednesdays at 10 on Vice.